If you have edited a few videos but have always wanted to set up your game and learn to edit with professional software, now's your chance. This will be taking a dive into the basics of professional video editing software. First up, a look at editing environments, the purpose of everything on your screen, and how to do a few basic operations. This is going to be a little intimidating at first if you have zero to little experience with professional editing software. Don't worry, this first lesson is here to get you acquainted with all the stuff you see on your screen, explain how a few things work, and get you more comfortable before actually doing much of anything. In subsequent lessons, you will look at creating a project from scratch, color correction, effects, and more. Video editing with professional software is actually very easy, but it's just intimidating because of all the buttons and options. Once you know what things are and have the basics down, you are able to do all sort of great things. While these lessons will deal primarily with Final Cut Pro, we'll also be exploring Adobe Premiere as a means of demonstrating how the lessons are really applicable to pretty much an professional video editing software. Even if you're not using Final Cut Pro, stick with it as we'll be addressing concepts and techniques that are useful in pretty much any editing program. The basics are probably the biggest hurdle to overcome simply because of the sheer number of options you have. But by the end of the chapter, we should be really in a good shape and be able to do the majority of what you'd want to do with the professional editing software. Any idea what the file browser might do? The name is kind of self-explanatory, but that doesn't mean there's nothing you need to know about it. While it may not be called the file browser in every editing application, it may be called the assets browser, for example, or something else. There is some window you're going to see that will help you manage your assets. Assets have a wide range of types. You can generally import video, audio, still images, and sometimes even motion graphic projects into your file browser. You'll also be able to create bins, which are basically folders and often look like them icon-wise. That will help you organize your assets. The most important things you'll be able to create, however, are sequences. Sequences store your edits and you can have a bunch of them. Basically, you edit a bunch of video within sequence and then export that sequence to a format of your choosing. You can also create sequences that contain other sequences. Why would you do this? Well, if you are editing a movie and you want to edit scene by scene, you could make a sense for each scene. When you are done editing all the scenes, you want them to be in one big sequence so you can watch the entire thing at once. To do this, you can just pull all the individual scene sequences together in one sequence and you've got your movie. This is useful, point 1, because sequences sometimes get pretty slow when you have got a ton of stuff in them. And point 2, you can also more easily make changes to a scene without disrupting everything else. It's kind of like using variables in programming. Your file browser stores all of these things and will be a very useful tool as you edit. The viewer is one of two video windows you have on your screen and it's traditionally on the left side. The viewer is what you use to view clips, apply edits and those clips globally, create effects and apply filters and transitions. Basically, it's where you do the gritty work. The canvas, which we will talk about next, is where you see the final product as laid out on your timeline, which we'll talk about later about the canvas. Okay, so how does the viewer work? When you open a clip in the file browser, you will see it in the viewer. You can choose in and out points for that clip that will globally apply any time you use the footage. This means that if you set an in and out point to shorten the length of the video clip, when you add it to your edit timeline, it will always appear to be that shortened length. If you are not making changes to it once, it's on the timeline. However, those edits will not carry over if you add that same footage to the timeline again. Basically, what happens in the viewer happens everywhere, and what happens in the timeline stays in the timeline. To look at it from the timeline's perspective, if you want to make alterations to a clip that's already on the timeline, you can generally do this in the viewer as well. Those edits will apply only to the instance of the clip on the timeline. Those edits will not carry over to the original footage in your file browser. The viewer is also where you will most likely edit your effects, transitions and filter settings. If you are color correcting, the color corrector will likely show up in the space designated for the viewer. If you are editing the length of a crossfade transition, it will happen here too. This isn't always the case with every video editing software, but it's the normal location. In a future lesson on effect, we'll get into this more. For now, just remember the viewer is where clip-specific edits take place. The canvas is the other one of the two video windows, and it's traditionally on the right side. The canvas is very simple to understand. It looks a lot like the viewer, but its job is simply to display the frame you are currently on in the timeline. It's where you view your edit as it currently stands. In my opinion, it seems like more of a viewer than the viewer, but what can you do? That's pretty much all there is to it. The timeline is where you can do your editing. Your plop clips on the timeline in the order you want them to appear. You can layer them to have multiple streams of video and audio playing back at once, and you can edit things to flow the way you want. In the timeline, you will have access to a few tools, but you will mainly use an arrow tool and a razor blade tool. The arrow is for picking up stuff and moving it around on the timeline. The blade is for making cuts. In Final Cut Pro, the arrow can be selected quickly by pressing A. In Premiere, you press V instead. To select the blade in Final Cut Pro, you press B. In Premiere, you press C. There are several little tricks, features and nuances to the timeline that we'll get into as the lessons progress. And you will find a few in the video included with this lesson. But its basic purpose is to be the area where you create your edit. The big picture is created on the timeline, and then you do more specific work in the viewer. When you want to see what you've done, you watch it on the canvas. If you want to add something to the timeline, you drag it in from the file browser. That's how everything works together. It's pretty simple, but it just looks intimidating because of all the buttons. That's your basic professional video editing software environment in a nutshell. Project setup involves all the same kinds of tasks in most editing software titles, but how you perform that setup tends to vary quite a bit. In Final Cut, you have to set up your system in 3 different places, and it assumes you're always using the same equipment. Adobe Premiere Pro CS5 actually handles this much better, in my opinion, because you set up everything on a project by project basis and can choose where you save the files with each new project. When setting up a project, there are few things you want to know and remember. Know the codec you're editing. What's a codec? The word is a combination of the words encode and decode, and it determines how your footage is compressed, so it takes up less space on your hard drive. Some codecs are better for editing than others. Example, DVC Pro HD is better for editing than H H.264, but H.264 is better for delivering video online. Oftentimes, your editing codec will be determined by the codec used for your footage. For example, if you are importing footage from a DV tape, you will probably just edit your footage using the DV code. On the other hand, you may prefer to use a lossless codec such as BitJazz Shear Video, so no quality is lost while you are editing. The resolution of the video you are editing, example, a standard definition is generally 640 into 480 or 640 into 460, and high definition is generally 1280 into 720 or 1920 into 1080. If the video is interlaced or progressive, you will need to check your camera's manual if you are not sure. But here's an explanation of the difference. And the frame rate, generally this will be 29.97 for American NTSC cameras and 25 for countries using PAL. But many cameras shoot at different frame rates, so be sure to check what you're using. There are generally 2.5 ways to import footage into a video editing project. If your camera uses tapes, you will need to use the log and capture method. Log and capture involves hooking up your camera to your computer, playing the tape and logging the in and out points for each clip you want to create. Once you have logged all your clips, you will tell the video editing software to import them and you can watch your camera automatically import everything. If you are using a card-based camera, you will want to import footage using a log and transfer method. In Final Cut Pro, you do this by bringing up a panel similar to the log and capture panel, but you will see clips showing up on your card. You can name them and add any relevant metadata, add them to a queue and then import them. The 0.5th way is just transferring your footage without logging it. Some cameras will require that you use log and transfer because the footage needs to be transcoded to another format before you can edit. If you are grabbing footage from a camera that just creates video files such as Canon DSLR, you don't necessarily need to transcode it, although it will be easier to edit if you do. If this is the case, you can just import your footage into your file browser. For those of you shooting video with DSLRs, be sure to check out how to shoot great video with your HD DSLR. Once you have imported your footage, editing is pretty simple. Just drag video and audio just onto the timeline in the order if you want. If you want to add effects, you need to shorten your footage a little bit where the transition is going to happen, so it has a little excess footage to use for that transition. This is a kind of difficult to explain and much easier to see. So check out the video to apply different transitions in both Final Cut Pro and Premiere Pro CS5. Exporting your edit is pretty simple. In Final Cut Pro and Premiere Pro CS5, you go to File, Export to see your options. In Final Cut Pro, you choose either QuickTime Movie or use QuickTime Conversion. The QuickTime Movie option will let you export a source file that's basically the same as your edit. This is great if you want to use another application to compress your video into various formats. If you want to make a compressed version directly from Final Cut Pro, the using QuickTime Conversion is probably what you'll want. Or you'll want to send the video to compressor. This will let you encode the file into any format supported by QuickTime. In Premiere Pro CS5, you only have one main option, Media. Choose that and you will get an excellent export window that will even let you preview all your exporting options. Premiere's Media export is like Final Cut Pro's options combined into one window that gives you even more options. You choose the format you want and export your file. If you want to export your file to multiple formats, you can queue them up as well. It's pretty great. That is basic overview of exporting options. We are dedicating an entire lesson to exporting your edit later on, so we'll take a deep dive then. For now, we are just sticking on with the basics. One of the big questions from this, what are we using to create or edit these screencasts? The answer is ScreenFlow. We often use it to edit video when I need to throw something together quickly because it's so fast and efficient. If you're looking for a dead simple video application and are not looking for a professional editing environment, ScreenFlow might actually be a really good choice for you. Final Cut, Premiere and most pro editing software come with basic motion effects you can apply to your footage. These are things like cropping, scaling, rotating, distorting and more. Both Premiere and Final Cut have these settings in the viewer. To access them, just load up a clip you want to edit and click Correct tab. In Final Cut, it's called Motion. In Premiere, it's called FX Settings. Once there, you'll see on your options and a small timeline to the right of them. From there, you can apply any adjustments you want. But one neat thing you can do is also add keyframes. Adding keyframes will let you animate the video in very basic ways, such as make it a bigger or smaller, spin around and more. You can't do anything really fancy here, but it's useful for many simple operations you'll need to perform when editing. Filter effects allow you to manipulate your video in various ways, and transition effects allow you to transition your video in various ways. The key difference is that filters apply to an entire video clip and a transition is means of pleasantly transitioning between two different clips. Something we've looked at in previous lessons more than once. Filters will let you do things like de-interlace, interlaced video, crop the frame to a custom and shape. This is known as a garbage matte. So you can potentially combine multiple video clips into one and alter the image in different ways. Pretty much every video editing application comes with a huge array of filters and most of them are either useless or operations you'll perform only on rare occasions. The best thing you can do is play around with all of them to get a better grasp on what they do. Transitions work in a similar ways and cross dissolve is pretty much the only one you're going to use. With some exceptions here and there, to see a few demonstrations associated with the lesson, we will move ahead. Color correction is generally handled by filters, but because it's the filter you're going to use most often, it deserves its own section. The built-in color correction filters that come with Final Cut and Premiere are not the best color correction filters you can get. Personally, I use Magic Bullet Colorista as an alternative. It's a giant step up, but it isn't cheap, $300, though I swear it was less than what when I bought it. Some editing software like the higher end stuff made by Avid does actually come with really great color correction. You should try what's built in before you go out and buy something. Although if you are using Final Cut Pro, I'd look elsewhere. Even if you turn to color, the dedicated application for color correction in Final Cut Studio. We are not going to take a deep dive into the intricacies of color correction here. But the basic principle you want to remember is that your goal is to use color to either white balance your footage or unbalance it to convey a feeling or emotion. White balancing is really simple. Open up your color corrector and look at your footage. If something looks off, you're going to see it. For example, if the background seems too cold, you'll notice too much blue. If those blue areas are really dark, they are in the shadow. If they are in the middle, they are in the midtones. If they are bright, they are in the highlights. Wherever they are, there is a color wheel in your three-way color corrector that represents each tone, shadows, midtones and highlights. Generally from left to right in that order, but they should be labeled. Each wheel should have a dot in middle of that. You can move anywhere on that color wheel. If you want to get rid of blues in the shadows, just locate blue on the color wheel and start moving the dot to the other side. You will see the footage start to warm up. Stop before it gets unnatural warm, unless that's your goal. If you want to convey a feeling of warmth or heat, pick warm colors and use the color corrector to add more of them in the relevant tones. Generally, the mid-tones have the greatest impact because they are the most visible. While professional color correction is a nuanced art and is very difficult, basic color correction is pretty simple. If you would like a demonstration of what you just read, go through further. Titles are really easy to create in both Final Cut Pro and Premiere Pro CS5. In Final Cut, you go to your viewer window and look for the little film strip icon with A. It should be sitting in the bottom right corner and you can see a demonstration in the video associated. This will give you a nice drop down menu with lot of neat things you can generate, but we are just going to concentrate on titles. While there is a specific section for titles, if you select Boris and then Title 3D, you will get the titles plugin with the most options. Boris Title 3D plugin isn't as robust as what you will find in Adobe Premiere Pro CS5, but it is pretty capable. You can add various effects to your text and even animate it just like you would your footage, as described in the motion effects sections. Adobe Premiere Pro CS5 handles titles in a slightly different way. Adobe put a lot of thought into what they call the title designer, and it's really great. They obviously think pretty highly of it because they have dedicated an entire menu to titles. Believe it or not, it's called the title menu. If you want to create a new title, just go to the title menu and choose the kind of title you want to create. Set it up how you want in the title designer and then close the window when you are done. You don't need to press OK or hit save because the title designer simply creates an asset in your file browser that you can drag onto the timeline. Before you start editing sound with Audacity or any software, you should understand these very important and common fundamentals and terminology. The editing basics are the most essential part as every individual goes through in the process. Project setup involves all the same kinds of tasks in most editing software titles, but how you perform that setup tends to vary quite a bit. In Final Cut, you have to set up your system in 3 different places and it assumes you are always using the same equipment. Taking a deep dive into the intricacies of color correction here, but the basic principle you want to remember is that your goal is to use color to either white balance your footage or unbalance it to convey a feeling or emotion. Adobe Premiere Pro CS5 handles titles in a slightly different way. Adobe put a lot of thought into what they call the title designer, and it's really great.